Hello. Thank you everyone for attending our virtual presentation. My name is Michael Molina, librarian for the Oklahoma Transportation Library, or OTL. My partner for this and many other knowledge management projects is Michelle Faribault, the Oklahoma Department of Transportation's KM consultant. We've put together this PowerPoint to explore a little about the OTL's library services and how it links to KM, and also to go into detail about a KM initiative we've been exploring with ODOT since 2018. I feel like it's important to first provide our definition of KM. For our purposes, KM will mean a variety of techniques to help workers quickly find accurate subject matter, information, and expertise to more efficiently answer a question, solve a problem, or complete a task. Part of your own KM operations may involve selling the idea to your superiors. On this slide, we provided a few examples of how KM can help organizations of multiple scales. OTL is the official library for the Oklahoma Department of Transportation. We're unique in that ODOT contracts with the University of Oklahoma for library services. So while we're housed at the university, our main client is ODOT. I'm the solo librarian and we have one student employee. Our primary users are ODOT employees, though we service other patrons, including academics and students, private companies, and the public. Our catalog consists of over 15,000 items. Helping to advance access to these items, we've made significant progress in digitizing them and are working on incorporating a standardized taxonomy of metadata, including TRR terms, for increased findability. Due to the pandemic, we've also been working on a virtual library space. As the image on the left shows, you will be able to explore the library and use interactive media to learn about different library services and access collections. The OTL has made a strong effort to integrate our services with KM best practices in mind. Our IT solutions for ODOT include a website and online catalog, providing updates to internal employee news, and disseminating research reports from ODOT as well as other organizations. We support communities of practice and lifelong learning through the hosting of seminars, conferences, and virtual presentations, which has actually gotten a lot easier since everyone is on Zoom these days. We have a backlog of many of our presentations hosted directly on our website. As librarians and knowledge information managers, we are equipped with knowledge about KM, including organizing knowledge and information and breaking down barriers to accessing that knowledge and information. Integrating such personnel into larger organizational efforts at KM can be extremely beneficial to any KM effort. On that note, I want to transition here and talk a little bit about one of our KM initiatives. In 2018, ODOT approached the library about joining a KM task force that would address ODOT's KM needs. This task force included the librarian, myself, representatives from Human Resources, Office of Research and Implementation, a field division, senior administration, and a KM consultant. That would be Michelle Faribault. This team went to conferences, conducted literature reviews, networked among different organizations, and learned how to start using a KM lens in everyday services. Our KM consultant, Michelle, helped guide the group's focus by emphasizing several things. First, people over technology. That is, you could have the greatest technological solution in the world, but without individuals, including dedicated KM champions that would help promote a strong KM culture, our KM initiative wouldn't make it very far. We found many KM initiatives falter without support from the top, so we wanted to focus on both a top-down and bottom-up approach, achieve buy-in from both leadership and everyday employees. This was going to prove an interesting challenge. We had a mandate. We had a diverse team including the library, KM consultant, and ODOT representatives. Now we just needed to figure out where do we go from here. To that end, ODOT sponsored a task order for research on a KM framework that could be used at the organization. This slide shows some of the activities this group achieved since 2018, and these included working with human resources on a digital hiring process, conducting key informant interviews, and fostering a broader culture of KM awareness. The first task order involved a lot of groundwork for setting up a KM program at ODOT. We started off by conducting an internal and external literature review to see where others stood in relation to KM programs and what challenges transportation organizations faced. We found issues pertaining to brain drain, siloed information, and lack of knowledge transfer infrastructure. It seemed like the private sector had been successful in luring a lot of state employees away, and they were much more adept at incorporating KM principles than the public sector. At the outset, the project had three main objectives: perform a literature review of KM best practices, create a framework for KM implementation at ODOT, and conduct a survey of ODOT employees that would inform the creation of this framework. As librarian, I was responsible for recruiting a KM consultant, Michelle, and I worked closely with her as we worked with the rest of the team to implement these objectives. The group also conducted interviews with key individuals within ODOT, identifying what their critical knowledge was and what KM challenges they faced. The team found out that KM was already happening at ODOT, whether people knew the term for it or not. People were storing and accessing knowledge all the time, sometimes using KM best practices, other times not so much. Our challenge going forward would be to make them aware of this and help shift the culture to acknowledge KM and KM best practices and incorporate it into their daily routines. The task order culminated in a presentation to ODOT leadership. The team highlighted the importance and potential impact of KM implementation for the organization and provided an overview on progress of the task order. ODOT leadership agreed with the team's assessment and gave them permission to continue for a second year. New directives for the task order included a focus on technological applications that could help implement KM at ODOT and conducting a pilot project focusing on one department at ODOT to test out scalable KM model of best practices that could be leveraged throughout the organization. The second task order began in 2019 and focused on implementing a scalable framework as a pilot project at a specific division at ODOT. The team chose to work with the Human Resources Department as it seemed a logical beginning for any KM program. Human Resources personnel would be best equipped to use these KM best practices and help disseminate them across the broader ODOT infrastructure. Rather than approach HR with a blanket KM mission, we decided to focus our energies on a specific problem. By looking at a specific problem, we could begin implementing KM solutions that were targeted and could ideally be scalable across the agency. Other objectives included refining the literature search to include more technological solutions, continue interviewing of ODOT personnel, mapping their critical knowledge, and creating a virtual space to store and access information. The team worked closely with HR and focused on rollout of a digital onboarding system for new hires. The team reviewed and made recommendations for this system, interviewed key HR personnel about where they saw problems with onboarding, and also reviewed where they stored and how they accessed information. The team developed a standardized survey of questions for these interviews. While the literature review focused on looking at different technological applications, the team decided to implement their solutions on Microsoft Teams for now. Due to the pandemic, ODOT had switched to using MS Teams for all their meetings and standardized it among its workforce. Since everyone at ODOT was learning to use the application, it made sense to leverage existing technology that people were already familiar with. The team purposefully established a model KM platform utilizing communication functionalities for project management, creating a wiki, and storing files for knowledge retention, and organizing and archiving information in a social context for future access. The team intended this model to be scalable and implemented at other departments across ODOT. The team's site, as you can see from the screenshot on the right, shows the different sections of information that members could access. The site stored documents relating to onboarding, interview recordings, sections for engineers in training, project summaries on lessons learned, and other key sections. In 2020, ODOT approved a third year of the KM task order. This time, the group's objectives included applying their scalable framework to other projects, interview employees about to retire as well as new hires to identify gaps in knowledge, interview employees in different divisions about their critical knowledge, foster a culture of using Microsoft Teams among new hires, create a KM liaison network among different departments and divisions, and create a draft of a project completion summary or lessons learned for when projects are completed. All of this will be documented in Microsoft Teams. The group is in the early stages of this project and looks forward to completing this by September of 2021. There's no denying that the pandemic has dramatically shifted the way many organizations offer their services. Libraries are no different, and perhaps are in a more vital position to create virtual spaces to help organize and increase access to information. Many people, forced to work from home, need strong access to KM solutions to perform their jobs properly. Pre-pandemic, you could just walk down the hall to get that document you needed. Now, not so much. The OTL and KM team has found success in fostering the growth of KM through creation of virtual spaces and promoting KM best practices. Being able to leverage existing technology through Microsoft Teams has also been a cost-saving measure that has increased efficiency at ODOT. Incorporating library practices in the cataloging and organization of this information has helped create a model that can be exported to other departments. Challenges remain, though. KM will always be competing with other agency needs, so learning how to demonstrate KM's value to senior leadership will always be important. Increasing awareness of KM and best practices, as well as making sure a technological platform is utilized agency-wide, will also be key. After reviewing KM implementation, both within the library and ODOT, it's safe to say that librarianship is knowledge management. From cataloging and organizing information, implementing taxonomies and metadata, designing virtual spaces, and how you deliver information services, a librarian or information manager can be a powerful driving force behind any KM endeavor. Whether you are that information manager or you know someone in your organization that fulfills that role, you have access to a wealth of KM knowledge that can be exported to the rest of your agency. Because KM is happening at your organization whether you call it that or not. Look at ways that KM best practices are or are not being performed. Consider things on a project-by-project basis to avoid being overwhelmed by implementing KM department-wide. Make sure and do your due diligence by completing a literature search or environmental scan to see where everyone else is related to KM. Perhaps most importantly, you need buy-in from senior staff. The best KM programs in the world would likely fail without that senior level support. Oftentimes, it's all about the sale. Learning to market KM and preparing quick speeches to introduce ideas and concepts are important. For example, you could say, "Did you know that by implementing KM best practices for new hires, you could reduce the time it takes for an employee to generate revenue and save money for the organization by 1.5 times their annual salary? Now multiply that by all the new hires in a 5-year period, and the cost savings are incredible." Lastly, you'll want to leverage existing technology when you can. I know everyone is looking for a cool new technological solution, but sometimes the best options are the ones you already have. Because if you remember from earlier in the presentation, we wanted to be people-focused. And if you can get buy-in from people from a product they're already familiar with, your odds of success are greater. That doesn't preclude adopting a new technological solution later on, but it's a good way to get people used to KM. Finally, for our last slide, I wanted to bring up this KM program framework from APQC. If you're unfamiliar with them, they're a leading authority in best practices, process and performance improvement, and knowledge management. We found this to be a good model to compare our stages in the KM process. For example, in year 1 of the task order, we were at the call to action stage, trying to get buy-in, looking at value of KM, and so forth. Year 2, which we wrapped up in 2020, was developing the KM strategy. We look forward to being in Stage 3 and further developing KM at the library and ODOT as a whole in the future. Lastly, here's our contact information if you'd like to reach us. We appreciate your time in listening to our presentation. Thank you.